Thank you for everyone being here, and it's good. It's a great honor to be here to give my first Black Hat talk, and I'm very excited standing here and hope that all of you guys can enjoy this talk. So particularly, the winter is coming back. Is to pay tribute to classics. One of my favorite HBO television series, The Game of Thrones. So winter is coming. Is a motto of a main character, the house Stark. So let me briefly introduce the speakers. So I'm Zi Zhang. I'm a PhD student from the University of New South Wales. And the first speaker is Yue Changchen. He is a security research scientist at the Baidu Security Research Lab. He is sitting in the first row. And the third speaker is Shuya Lipo. He is my supervisor, and he is a principal research scientist at CSIRO, Australia. The last speaker is Zhi Wang. He is an associate professor at Florida State University. So, in the very first place, I will briefly introduce the Rowhammer bug and give the most advanced software-only defense against the Rowhammer attack. And then we developed a proof of concept and gave three possible mitigations as well. At last, we gave our sound bites of this talk. So what is Rowhammer? Literally speaking, hammering a row is to frequently access a row. So because the density of DRAM cells in the DRAM modules increases significantly, and these cells can electrically interact with each other. So by frequently accessing a row can cause the electrical charge of its adjacent row disturbance. So let's dive into the background of the DRAM structure. So the DIMM is called the dual inline memory module, and it has one or two racks corresponding to its front or back side. And each rack has multiple chips, and multiple chips make up multiple backs. So the cause of Rowhammer lies in the back, a very basic unit for the memory access. So on the right side of the picture, we can say that each back has rows of cells, and each cell consists of a capacitor and an access transistor. So on the right side of the picture, the wall line collects all the cells within a row, and the B line collects all the cells within a column. So both the wall line and B line have a direct impact on how memory access is performed. So for the memory access, we have three primary steps. The first step is to activate or open the row. So specifically, the row's wall line is raised to a high voltage, enabling the row's access transistors, and this will collect the row's capacitors to the bin line. As such, the row's data will be read out into the row buffer. In the same time, the row's capacitors will be fully charged to be refreshed. So in the second step, the row buffer will satisfy the memory access as required. So if the memory access is completed, or another memory access occurs in the same back, the current row needs to be closed. So the row's wall line is discharged to a low voltage, disabling the row's access transistors, and this will disconnect the row's capacitors from the B line. So, and in the meantime, the row buffer will also be cleared. So up to now, everything seems going well, but unfortunately, the capacitors of cells will lose charge over time, and all the rows of cells need to be refreshed at a periodic time, and the typical periodic time is 64 milliseconds. So because the capacitors will lose charge gradually and need to be recharged at a periodic time, in 2014, Kim reported a key observation that frequently opening rows n+1 and n-1 will cause B flips in row n. The B flip means that some cells in row n have been permanently B flipped from B0 to B1 or B1 to B0. So motivated by Kim's observation, Sebon from the Google was the first to compromise the bug-free kernel and gain the kernel privilege by the means of rowhammer. So the critical rowhammer code written by the Kim is placed on the right side. So we can see that we assume that X is in row n plus 1 and Y is in row n minus 1. To induce B flips in row n, we must access X and Y in a loop. And inside this loop, we need to flush the X and Y's cache, and also the row buffer, where the X and Y resides. So to flush the CPU cache, we can use the self-flush instruction. Alternatively, we can stuff other data's cache to evict the target data's cache. Also, to have a direct impact on the row n, we need to clear the row buffer. Thus, as such, we perform alternate access of X and Y repeatedly. So, by the way, the line 6, the mfence instruction is unnecessary to induce B flips, and this is also reported by Sebon. So currently, we have 3 existing rowhammer methods. The first is double-sided rowhammer. So it hammers 2 rows on each side of the target row, and this method requires virtual to physical address mapping, as well as the physical address to DRAM row mapping. The second is single-sided hammer. It randomly selects a pair of addresses, and it is likely for the pair of addresses are in the same bag, and thus clear the row buffer. The last one is one location hammer. It randomly selects one address, so it relies on the DRAM memory controller to clear the row buffer. So take the code again as an example. We can say that for double-sided rowhammer, X and Y are adjacent to the target row. For the single-sided rowhammer, either X or Y is adjacent to the target row. So what these 2 methods in common is that X and Y must be in the same bag so as to clear the row buffer. And this requirement does not focus on one location rowhammer. X is just adjacent to the target row, and the DRAM controller is responsible for the row buffer clearance. So to mitigate the rowhammer attack, numerous rowhammer defenses have been proposed. We have 2 categories. The first one is hardware defense. These hardware solutions require the hardware changes to the legacy DRAM modules. So that's why they are not practical. So the hardware defense, the first intuitive solution is to increase the row refreshing frequency from 62 milliseconds, as I mentioned before, to 32 milliseconds. The idea behind this solution is that an attacker must activate the row for many times, so as to induce B flips in its adjacent rows. So we increase the frequency so as to refresh the rows as soon as possible. And this will prevent the rows from being the victim row from being B flipped. But however, once one rowhammer exploit has already succeeded, given the frequency of 32 milliseconds. The second solution is to introduce error correcting code memory. That's called the ECC. ECC is able to correct 1-bit errors and detect double-bit errors. However, the rowhammer bug can induce multiple bit flips, and this cannot be properly detected by ECC. The third one is to apply probabilistic adjacent row activation. So as the name suggests, para is to intensive reading from a row will trigger an activation of its adjacent rows with a high probability. And this will prevent the adjacent rows from linking charge at a much faster rate. So the other one, similarly, we can utilize the target row refreshing capability to ask the memory controller to refresh specified rows. The last one is to specify maximum activation count. So all of the last 3 methods require hardware changes to the legacy DRAM modules. So we come to the practical defense, the software defense. We also have two subcategories. The first category is ad hoc solutions. But these solutions are primarily limited to preventing specific rule hammer attacks, which utilize certain system features, such as a page table. Page table is used to translate a virtual address to a physical address. But this interface has already been disabled for an unprivileged user. And the page map is used to facilitate the double-sided rule hammer. So we focus more on the general solutions. Firstly, we use a binary code analysis to analyze common behaviors exposed in the rule hammer exploits, such as high-resolution timers and the cache flush instructions. However, an attacker can introduce the enclaves by Intel SGX to bypass the binary check or use network packets to trigger remote rule hammer exploits. The second one is to perform a complete rule hammer test and then blacklist all the vulnerable rows. On one hand, this solution can eliminate the rule hammer bug. On the other hand, this solution will render more than 95% of the system memory unusable. So it is also not practical. The last one is to utilize the performance counter. So as the rule hammer will incur high cache miss rates, intuitively we can use performance counters to observe the cache miss rate. When the cache miss rate reaches the threshold, a monitoring process can be triggered to check whether a real rule hammer exploit is running. But this method has false positives and incurs high performance overhead. So now we come to the most advanced software-only defense, CAT. Please note that two new defenses emerged after our submission. So we will talk about them in the mitigation section. So from a high level, CAT is a physical isolation scheme. Just like this picture shows, the island is split into two halves. One half is physically isolated from the other. So for CAT, it divides the physical memory into mutually exclusive partitions and views the ownership of each physical partition as single. So as this picture shows, the domain has only access to its own partition A, and any memory request from an individual domain will be only served by its own partition. So in a nutshell, the single ownership means that each secure domain has access to its own partition. So to CAT's current implementation, CAT divides the physical memory into user and kernel partition, and this guardian row is placed between these partitions. So any B flips induced by an attacker will only occur in her own partition. The user partition, and or in the guardian rows, and this will make the B flips useless. So CAT is only a software only approach without modification, without hardware modifications, and it is practical to protect legacy systems. Furthermore, we can utilize CAT to build other fine-grained domain isolation, such as browser and sandbox isolation, the privilege process and the regular process isolation, and so on and so forth. So eventually, the cat Tom catches the mouse Jerry. So before we compromise the cat, let's summarize the case steps required for rule hammer exploit. Firstly, we need to fill up a victim row with sensitive data structures such as page tables. And next, we position attacker accessible rows adjacent to the victim row. And last, we perform the rule hammer. If we gain privilege escalation, then we succeed. So let's review all the defenses. So all the defenses are prior to CAT are trying to mitigate the first and the last step. And what they managed to do is to eliminate or detect the rowhammer bug. But for cat, it is tolerant to rowhammer, and it is trying to prevent the victim row from being approached by the attacker accessible rows. So for our attack, we assume that the kernel is bug-free and protected by cat. So as such, the user and the kernel isolation are isolated from each other. So since the kernel is protected by cat, we have no idea about where the vulnerable rows are located in the kernel partition. And the last is that we have no access to the page map. So is it possible for us to rowhammer the kernel? Yes, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to stand here. Yeah. So we have listed the 5 key steps for our successful rowhammer exploit. The first is to clearly identify the cat's weak list and then abuse the weak list to stealthily position attacker accessible memory adjacent to the kernel objects. In this case, we use the page tables. And the third step is to perform efficient single-sided rowhammer, because we have no page map interface. And the fourth step is to verify whether exploitable bit flips have occurred. And if yes, if not, we try again. And if yes, we have gained the kernel privilege, and then we can scan the kernel memory, flush TLB, and change user ID to 0. So the main challenges lies in the first 3 steps, and then next we talk about them in detail. So in theory, the single ownership dictated by cat does hold, but in real world, in modern system, the modern system views the ownership as dynamic, particularly the double ownership. So what is double ownership? Let's see this picture. So the memory region X has 2 owners, the domain A and domain B. And a similar situation also occurs to partition B, the region Z. So let's to illustrate the double ownership, we use a real-world scenario to illustrate. So if let's regard the domain A as a user domain, the domain B as a kernel domain. So if user domain wants to perform a direct IO write operation, the kernel domain will allocate the region X for the user domain to process data. At this moment, the region X has just one owner, the user domain. But when the kernel domain accesses the region X to copy data into a device, then at this time, the region X, the ownership of region X is converted into double. So that's where the double ownership comes from. And actually, an adversary usually resides in the user domain, and she must get access to a high privilege memory region so as to perform a meaningful rowhammer. So the region Z is what we are interested to identify. So for the user and the kernel domain, we want to identify the region Z, and we term such region Z as hammerable. So the user after kernel, for this model, we have 2 types of double ownership. The first is kernel after user, and the second is user after kernel. So the region Z refers to a kernel memory region that is initially owned by the kernel domain, and then the user domain joins the ownership. So this region Z, is what an adversary is interested to identify. So we summarize the properties of hammerable buffer. So the hammerable memory is initially owned by the kernel, and an unprivileged user can access this memory. So the challenge is to identify the hammerable memory in the real-world systems. Like the previous slide, for the split island, the bridge interface is introduced to counteract the physical isolation. Similarly, for the split partitions, mmap interface can be abused to hammer the kernel partition. So the kernel will allocate the region Z and map the region Z into the user domain by the means of mmap system call. So at this time, the region Z is potentially hammerable, and this gives us the hint. We can search all the mmap operations for that have the hammerable memory. So in this picture, we can see that the number of mmap operations increases significantly as the Linux kernel evolves. And for specific Linux kernel 4.17, the device drivers has a much higher number of mmap operations, and so it is highly likely for the device drivers having the hammerable memory. So as a use case, we have identified SCSI generic buffer in the Linux SSI subsystem as a hammerable memory. So up to now, we have identified the cat's weakness. So next, we have to stealthily position the hammerable buffer next to page table. And we have proposed a new technique, the memory ambush, to address this problem. So for the Linux body allocator, it maintains multiple lists of blocks. For blocks that have the same list, they have the same memory size. And every block has a power of 2 number of pages. And these pages are physically continuous. So the dash line means that once a block is split into 2 equal blocks, the split block has the same size as the others. For example, this one has a smaller size as the smaller one, and the unused split block will be linked into the smaller block list. So here is the question: if hammerable buffer and the page table share a random block, like this one, are they for sure adjacent to each other? The answer is no, because 2 adjacent physical addresses do not imply 2 adjacent DRAM rows. For example, the addresses 1000 and 0FFF, they are physically continuous, but they are in the same row instead of 2 adjacent rows. Fortunately, 2 row-aligned adjacent physical addresses indicate 2 adjacent DRAM rows. This is because that the DRAM controller uses the most significant bits of a physical address to select a DRAM row. So we call the block that should be shared by the 2 objects as the target block, and the target block should contain the size of 2 adjacent rows. And any block that has a larger size, we call it a large block, and any block that has a smaller size, we call it small block. So to determine the size of target blocks, we have 3 equations. So the size of a target block should be twice the size of all the rows per row index, and the size of all the rows per row index is further determined by the number of DIMMs, the number of bags per 1 DIMM, and the size of a single row in a single bag. So this solves the problem of how we determine the target block size, and as we have no knowledge about where the vulnerable locations in the kernel memory, we have to place more page table pages onto the target blocks. So we abuse the mmap to do page table allocation. As we know, the mmap is used to map a file or device into a memory, and the Seaborn has abused this feature to control the page table allocation. So specifically, we create a memory mapped region. And and populate the region by accessing, like write or read this region. So the page table pages will be allocated. The page table pages will be allocated to translate the virtual addresses to physical addresses. So during this period of time, the page table pages will be allocated. So with all this knowledge in mind, we now describe the key steps required for our memory ambush technique. So in this figure, it shows the initial state of the kernel memory. And The kernel memory also has multiple lists of different blocks, and some small blocks have already been allocated for like the network ring buffer. So if we want to share the target blocks between the two objects, we have to drain the small blocks first. So in Figure B, we exhausted all the small blocks using the page tables by the means of mmap system call. So after we exhausted the small blocks, we start to allocate the double-earned buffers and the page tables from the target blocks. And if the double-earned buffers complete its allocation, we still continue doing the page table allocation until a specified memory threshold is reached. So this will make our technique stealthy. So after positioning the attacker accessible rows adjacent to the page tables, now we have the last problem to address, no page map since Linux 4.0. So we resort to a timing channel. The timing channel is that, as the previous slides have already shown, X and Y are in different rows of the same back, and the row buffer. And inside this loop, if we access X and Y repeatedly, the row buffer will be repeatedly loaded, reloaded, and cleared. So this will cause the phenomenon, the row conflict, because X and Y will have a higher access latency compared to if the X and Y are in different backs. So we abuse the row conflict to help us select addresses that are in the same back, so we can perform an efficient single-sided row hammer. Specifically, we select 1,000 pairs that are in the same bank of different rows, and another 1,000 pairs that are in different backs, and measure the access latency respectively. So in this demo machine, we can say that more than 92% of the pairs in the DSP have more than 360 cycles, and more than 97% of the pairs in the long DSP have less than 360 cycles. Also, in this Lenovo machine, we can say that 100% of the pairs in the DSP have more than 360 cycles, and more than 99% of the pairs in the long DSP have less than 360 cycles. So based on this latency, we can select the addresses more wisely. So the first three primary steps have been completed, and now we need to verify whether exploitable bit flips have occurred. So the idea of verification is like if a virtual page is no longer pointing to a physical page, then we can make sure that a page table has been bit flipped, and if we can find another page pointing to a page table page, it means that we have gained the kernel privilege, because unexploitable page table means that we can write or read access to all the physical memory. So after that, we can scan the kernel memory and change the user ID to 0, so as to gain the root privilege. So now we will give a demo to show how we gain the privilege escalations. So we have two reds running on two separate CPU cycles, core 0 and core 1. These two reds do nothing in an infinite loop, and they're just used to flush the TLB. And when we gain the root privilege, now let's run our real row hammer exploit. So after the small blocks are drained, and we start to allocate the SSI generic buffer as well as the page tables. And after a memory threshold is reached, we can start row hammering. So after rehamming for like 39 times, we can find an exploitable page table. And we dump its first 8 entries. And we can say that all the 8 entries conform to the PT format. So now let's get the root privilege. So the basic idea is that we change the saved user ID, effective user ID to the real user ID and do the same thing to the group ID. And then we can construct a key string composed of the 3 same user ID and the 3 same group ID. And when we change one entry, when we change one PT entry with a different physical number, we check whether the newly mapped page has a key string. If yes, so we can say that if yes, we have found a matching. So if yes, we have found a matching structure. We have found a matching structure of credential. Credential is where the user ID resides. So we write 3 zeros. We have 3 zeros into the 3 user ID, the structure's user ID, the structure's 3 user ID respectively, and check and then invoke the getUID function to check whether the current process user ID has been changed to 0. So if not, we try again, or we continue searching, and restore the current structure's user ID to its original state. And by doing so, we can say that we can locate the current process user ID and change it to 0. So during this process, I need to explain that the 2 rats, during the process, we have to flush the TLB because we changed the PT entry. So this is because that we need to switch the process between core 0 and core 1. And considering that the 2 rats are running on core 0 and core 1, once the current Rowhammer exploit has been scheduled on either core, a context switch will occur, and this will trigger an automatic TLB flush. So in the end, we can say that we have gained the root privilege. Okay, so that's all for attack. So if someone thinks that disabling the SSI generic buffer is enough to countermeasure our attack, we have also developed another exploitable bflips. We have also developed another exploitable buffer, the video buffer, in the video for Linux subsystem. So actually, we have other hammerable buffers in these directories. So okay, so the next topic is about the mitigation. So we have 3 possible mitigations. The first is to allocate the double-end buffer from user partition. This is an intuitive solution. And the other 2 defenses emerged after our submission to Black Hat. And all of these 3 solutions have their own limitations and are not effective enough. For the first one, we can say that if we allocate the double-end buffer from the user partition, this can prevent the kernel from being hammered. However, this will expose sensitive buffers to user space, still not secure enough. So for the second one, it is published in OSDI 2018, and the main idea is to separate the row that contains data with 2 guarding rows. So this method suffers from the row remapping and does not consider the case where bflips can occur in multiple rows. The last one is to place the page table pages on 2 cells in DRAM. However, this method still suffers from the exploitable bflips. So our ongoing work is that, so can we break all of them? This is a question mark, but we think it is possible. So please follow up our next Rowhammer talk. So last we gave our soundbites. Physical isolation is powerful against current Rohammer attacks. However, it is hard to achieve in practice due to the double-end buffers, and this will make the Rohammer bug still exploitable. So the double-end buffers are for the sake of performance and functionality, and it is challenging to remove them. So even facing the user and the kernel physical isolation, our exploit is still able to gain the root and the kernel privileges. Okay, so that's all for our talk. Thank you very much. Any questions? This is our first speaker, Yue Changchen.
So, any questions?
Can you talk about how this can be used in the virtualized environment?
You mean this attack in the virtualized environment, right?
Could you attack the hypervisor or make changes to?
Currently, this target for the kernel stuff, but for the hypervisor, like I think the para-virtualized hypervisor, that definitely it can work. But for the full virtualized, based on the Intel VTD and VTX stuff, this will be challenging. Intuitively speaking, let me think. The hypervisor, we need a double ownership. That's very hard. Maybe not. Maybe not impossible. Yeah. But for the para-virtualized environment, it's suffering. But for the full virtualized environment, if you have some para-virtualized driver stuff, I mean, also may be possible. But depends on the real environment. If a pure full virtualized environment, I think this attack cannot happen. Yeah. Yeah. You get Mac. Yeah. The open. Yeah. Turn on.
Hello. Hi. So you mentioned trying to bypass the most advanced Rohammer defense. So did you also consider if the parts itself, like most of the latest vendors, they claim that their parts itself, the DRAM parts itself are Rohammer resistant. So is it like, is that the most, if you consider both hardware software, probably that is the most advanced defense, or do you mean the most advanced software defense without altering hardware?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Yes, for the hardware defenses, there have some limitations we already listed in the slides. Currently, the most advanced is the software-only solutions. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so like going forward for new devices, I think vendors would be using the parts which are DRAM resistant. So does this apply more to legacy products where there's not any option to change the DRAM part, or even for forward-looking devices which have DRAM parts which are Rohammer resistant? Will such exploits be realizable?
I don't catch the key point. Can you?
Yeah, like for new devices, I think manufacturers will use the DRAM parts which are electrically Rohammer resistant. That's what the memory vendors proclaim. So have you explored those parts as well to mount such kind of attacks, or?
Yeah, you mean if the hardware, the manufacturer fundamentally can fix this attack from the DIMM, that's definitely can completely stop this attack. But until now, all the existing the DRAM stuffs, they cannot completely solve this problem actually. Due to the high density, they have increasing from gigabyte to the terabyte. So the density stuff, maybe they need to significantly change the hardware structures to address this problem. Yes. So, okay. No. Any questions? Yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.